The wedding invitations arrived in a crisp ivory envelope, embossed with a gold crest I barely recognized. Inside, the delicate script announced the upcoming union of my son, Michael, and his fiancée, Sarah. There was no mention of my presence. Not a single word. It was as if my role in his life had been meticulously erased, like a faulty line of code scrubbed from existence. For a moment, the air in my study grew thin, and I found myself clutching the edge of my mahogany desk, knuckles white, until the tremor subsided. It was a strange, hollow feeling, a severance so profound it felt like a physical amputation. My life, before this, had been quiet. Predictable, some might say. Mornings began with the ritual of brewing single-origin coffee, the aroma filling my well-appointed home. I'd spend hours in my garden, tending to roses that bloomed with a defiant vibrancy, a stark contrast to the muted emotions that often simmered beneath the surface of my family life. Michael was my only child, the sun around which my world had once revolved. Now, that sun had been systematically eclipsed, not by a sudden storm, but by a slow, deliberate creep of shadows I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. There was the time, years ago, during a family dinner that was supposed to celebrate my retirement. Michael, then a young lawyer, had spent the entire evening subtly undermining my business acumen. "Dad, you always were a bit traditional," he'd said, a dismissive wave of his hand accompanying the pronouncement, as if my decades of building a successful company were mere quaint hobbies. Sarah, ever present even then, had offered a saccharine smile and a murmured agreement, her eyes, I now realize, already assessing the landscape of potential gain. I'd let it slide, chalking it up to youthful arrogance, a phase I expected him to outgrow. Then came the inheritance. My own parents, a generation before, had left me a modest but comfortable sum, a nest egg that allowed me a degree of financial freedom. When my father passed, Michael had been eager. I remember him calling, not to offer condolences, but to inquire about the probate timeline. "Just trying to get a lay of the land, Dad," he'd explained, his voice lacking any genuine sympathy. Later, I'd found him in my living room, long after the funeral, meticulously going through my father's personal effects, not with sentiment, but with a spreadsheet open on his phone. He was calculating, I realized with a sickening lurch, the division of assets. He'd even suggested, with an unnerving calmness, that I should liquidate certain investments, to optimize returns. These were not isolated incidents, but threads in a tapestry of entitlement and a chilling disregard for my feelings. He'd always been the one to ask for favors, rarely to offer support. He'd borrowed money without question, assumed access to my resources, and always positioned himself as the wronged party when I set boundaries. Sarah was his enabler, his mirror, reflecting his ambition and fanning the flames of his self-importance. They saw my quiet contentment as a resource to be exploited, my generosity as a weakness to be exploited. The wedding invitation, devoid of my name, was the crescendo. The silence that followed its discovery was not an absence of sound, but a presence of unbearable weight. I reread the invitation, searching for a hidden meaning, a misplaced RSVP card, anything that suggested a mistake. But there was nothing. Just the stark, undeniable reality: I was not invited to my own son's wedding. The week before the ceremony, Michael called. His voice was carefully modulated, a false sincerity that grated on my nerves. "Dad," he began, and I braced myself. "Sarah and I wanted to finalize some arrangements. We're consolidating our finances, and we were wondering if you'd be willing to help us with a down payment on our new home." He paused, expecting my immediate compliance, as he always did. I heard Sarah's faint voice in the background, an eager murmur. I pictured her, leaning in, her eyes bright with anticipation. I let the silence stretch. The hum of the refrigerator in my kitchen was the only sound. "You're not inviting me to your wedding," I stated, my voice unervingly calm. There was a beat of surprised silence. Then, a nervous laugh. "Dad, what are you talking about? Of course, you're invited." "The invitation says otherwise," I replied, my gaze fixed on the embossed gold crest. His tone shifted, hardening. "Look, Dad, we decided we wanted a very intimate ceremony. Just close friends and family. You know how difficult things can get with extended family. We didn't want any drama. And I'm considered drama? My voice was a low, steady hum. No, it's not like that, he stammered, clearly uncomfortable. It's just. Sarah's parents are quite particular, and we wanted to keep the guest list manageable. You'll understand. He expected me to nod, to accept his flimsy excuse, to once again reek into my quiet role as the conveniently absent parent. But something had broken within me, a dam of passive acceptance finally giving way. The sheer audacity, the casual cruelty of it, was astonishing. Banning me from his wedding, the culmination of his life so far, and then asking for a financial handout as if nothing had happened. I understand perfectly, Michael, I said, the words tasting like ash. You've made your choices very clear. So, about the house, he pressed, oblivious to the shift in the air. No, Michael, I said, my voice even colder. I will not be helping you with the house. A huff of impatience. Dad, come on. This is important. We're talking about the start of our married life. My part in your married life, I stated, my gaze now fixed on a framed photograph of a much younger, smiling Michael, seems to be over. The conversation ended shortly after that. Not with shouting, not with accusations, but with a chilling, mutual understanding that something irreversible had occurred. I hung up the phone and walked to my study, the same study where I'd received the invitation. The light filtering through the windows seemed to illuminate the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny testament to the passage of time, to the moments I had overlooked, the warnings I had ignored. My mind, now sharp and focused, began to work. The quiet endurance of years coalesced into a singular, resolute purpose. I didn't feel rage, not anymore. Just a profound, icy clarity. I opened my laptop and logged into my secure financial portal. Michael and Sarah's wedding wasn't just an event, it was the culmination of their plans, the launchpad for their future, a future they had so carelessly assumed would always have my support. I had spent years building my business, meticulously planning for its succession. Michael had always assumed he would inherit it, that it was his birthright. He'd spoken of it, planned around it, even boasted about it to his friends. He'd never considered the possibility that his actions, his callousness, might have consequences. He'd never considered that I had options, that my life's work was not merely a piggy bank for his future endeavors. My company, a diversified conglomerate with holdings in technology and real estate, was my legacy. It was also my leverage. For years, I had been establishing a trust, a complex web of legal and financial instruments designed to protect my assets and ensure their responsible management. It was something I had set up not out of paranoia, but out of a deep-seated understanding of human nature, particularly the nature of those who felt entitled to what wasn't theirs. The day before Michael's wedding, a day he and Sarah were likely spending in prenuptial bliss, I made a series of secure calls. I spoke to my lawyers, my financial advisors, and the executor of the trust one had so carefully constructed. I provided them with the necessary documentation, the final signatures. It was all executed with a quiet efficiency, a methodical dismantling of assumptions. There were no dramatic pronouncements, no grand gestures. Just the signing of a few final papers, the transferring of signatory powers, the formalization of a plan that had been years in the making. I ensured that my company, its assets, its future prospects, were irrevocably tied to the trust, and that the beneficiaries of that trust were not my son, but a series of carefully chosen charitable organizations dedicated to education and environmental conservation. I didn't contact Michael or Sarah. I didn't need to. Their self-absorption was their blindfold. They were so convinced of their inevitable inheritance that they couldn't fathom a scenario where it didn't happen. The wedding took place as planned. I received no pictures, no updates, no calls. My phone remained silent, a stark contrast to the usual barrage of texts and calls I received from friends and acquaintances who knew of my son's impending marriage. I spent the day in my garden, the roses in full bloom, their scent a comforting, familiar presence. The fallout began 2 days later. My phone erupted. First, frantic texts from Michael, demanding to know why I hadn't called to congratulate him. Then, the calls from my estranged sister, Carol, who always seemed to be sniffing around for any whiff of family drama. She'd heard from Sarah's mother, apparently, that I wasn't present. "What happened, George?" Carol's voice was laced with a practiced concern that always sounded like thinly veiled curiosity. "Sarah's mother said you weren't at the wedding. Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfectly fine, Carol," I replied, my voice measured. "But Michael's so upset," she pressed. "He said you just disappeared. And he said you refused to help them with the house." "My choices are my own, Carol," I said, and then, before she could pry further, I added, "And as for the house, I've recently made some significant changes to my financial planning. My assets are now managed through a trust. It's very comprehensive. My son, unfortunately, is not a direct beneficiary." There was a stunned silence on the other end. I could practically hear her mind whirring, trying to process this unexpected turn of events. "What do you mean?" "You mean, you're not leaving him anything?" "I'm leaving a legacy," I corrected, the word feeling solid and true on my tongue. "A legacy to causes that matter. Michael's future, as he envisioned it, is now entirely his to build, without my financial scaffolding." The subsequent days were a flurry of frantic communications from Michael and Sarah. Their initial demands morphed into accusations, then into desperate pleas. They tried to appeal to my emotions, to my supposed parental duty. They spoke of their dreams, their plans, their supposed hardships. They even brought in flying monkeys, my sister, a few of Michael's aunts and uncles who had always sided with him, to try and persuade me. Michael called, his voice raw with a desperate anger I hadn't heard before. "How could you do this, Dad? This is insane. You're ruining our lives." "You made your choices, Michael," I said, the calmness in my voice a stark contrast to his panic. "I am simply living with the consequences of yours." Sarah, in a more calculated move, sent a legal letter, hinting at financial impropriety and undue influence. My lawyers responded swiftly, detailing the structure of the trust and the validity of my decisions. Their attempt to leverage legal threats backfired spectacularly, only solidifying my resolve and the absolute finality of my actions. The social repercussions were swift and predictable. Whispers spread through our limited social circles. Some were sympathetic to Michael, seeing me as a cruel father. Others, those who had witnessed his entitled behavior over the years, nodded their heads in understanding, even approval. The narrative shifted, not quickly, but inexorably. The spoiled son who had alienated his father, rather than the wronged father who had disinherited his son. Michael and Sarah's grand plans for their future, so heavily reliant on my financial contributions, began to unravel. The down payment for their home, the extravagant honeymoon they had planned, even their envisioned lifestyle, it all crumbled without the foundation they had so confidently expected. Their social media, once filled with aspirational posts, fell silent, then reappeared with a more somber, less ostentatious tone. The reality of earning their own way, of building a life from the ground up, was a harsh lesson they had never been forced to confront. There was no celebration, no triumphant declaration of victory on my part. The satisfaction was a quiet, internal hum. It was the quiet knowledge that I had not acted out of spite, but out of a deep-seated need for justice, for balance. I had allowed my son, and his wife, to believe they were the architects of their future, only to reveal that the blueprints they relied upon were no longer valid. They had been so consumed by their entitlement that they had never bothered to check if the house was still standing. Now, my life returned to its quiet rhythm. The garden still bloomed. The coffee still brewed. But the underlying tension was gone, replaced by a profound sense of peace. I had protected my legacy, not just financially, but emotionally. I had proven that actions, however quietly executed, can have monumental consequences. The silence that now surrounded my son was not a silence of my making, but a silence he had forged for himself, through his own choices, and his own profound lack of gratitude. And in that silence, for me, lay a quiet, unassailable peace.